Starting at level 2, Warlocks gain 2 Invocations, and then acquire more of them as they get to higher levels, which are basically specific passive abilities that Warlocks can pick from a long list. So in this video, we'll be going over some of the best Warlock Invocations you can take, no matter how you gain those Invocations. And at number 10, we have the Mask of Many Faces. This invocation grants you access to the Disguise Self spell, which you can cast at will without using any spell slots. Disguise Self is a first level spell which basically allows you to alter your appearance and do anything you want, just as long as the general body shape is similar to your regular body, so you can't use it to turn yourself into a Tarrasque, for example. But you can use it to disguise your appearance, by changing whatever you want about yourself. And the ability to just change what you look like at a moment's notice could either be incredibly useful all the time, or not useful at all, depending on what kind of campaign you're running. If it's more political intrigue, then the ability to disguise yourself into looking like someone completely different could be infinitely more important than if you're just doing a dungeon crawl, where it doesn't matter what you look like. With the ability to cast it at will, you could change what you look like 5 different times while walking down the street, though it would look weird if you're constantly changing drastic appearances. So if you're running away from some kind of local authorities, you could just run behind a corner, instantly change to someone who looks completely different, and then just kind of escape notice. Most level spells that are not rituals are not really balanced around being used an infinite amount of times, instantly. So anything that lets you do that is generally pretty strong, under certain circumstances. Disguise Self is pretty situational, which is why it does make this list, but only at the bottom spot at number 10. Also bonus points, if you take the Eldritch Adept feat from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, Disguise Self is one of the viable options to pick because it doesn't have a prerequisite. So non-Warlock characters can take this invocation at the cost of using up one of your feats. Although, I wouldn't say Unlimited Disguise Self is good enough to give up one of your feats for, as there's a lot of pretty strong feats as you can see in my video on the best ones. It is an option though. And at number 9, we have Fiendish Vigor. This invocation allows you to cast the False Life spell without using any spell slots or material components at its first level. False Life is a spell which allows you to gain 1d4 plus 4 temporary hit points for 1 hour. Now, seeing as you can cast this without using any materials or spell slots, which is not exactly the same thing as using it at will, but pretty close, you can just keep using the ability over and over until you roll a perfect 4 on that 1d4. That way you always have 8 extra temporary hit points, just as long as you have the time available to reroll it for the highest amount. And having an extra 8 hit points for every battle is kind of equivalent to having an extra hit die. So it's a really nice buffer at lower levels. So if you don't have something in your party already granting you temporary hit points, since they don't stack, this is actually a pretty nice amount to have until you change it up for something else at a higher level, as Warlocks are allowed to change one of their invocations for another one each time they level up, without any kind of penalties. So there's really no reason to not have something like this at early levels before changing it into better ones at higher levels. Unless of course you choose one of the other invocations on this list. Fiendish Vigor also doesn't have any prerequisites, so it's another option available to the Eldritch Adept feat. Although literally any other feat which increases your health is better than picking up Fiendish Vigor with this feat. And at number 8 we have Investment of the Chainmaster. This is an invocation which was added with Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and is basically a required feat for Pact of the Chainmaster Warlocks now, because of just how good it is. This ability basically super buffs your Find Familiar pet, where when you use your Find Familiar, you're able to grant the familiar the following benefits, where it can either gain a flying or swimming speed of 40 feet, you can use your bonus action to command it to attack rather than your action, the familiar's attacks are considered magical, it can use your spell save DC if it forces a saving throw, and if it would take damage, you can use your reaction to grant it resistance against that damage, so that it can stay alive easier. And the great thing about this is allowing you to attack with your familiar using your bonus action, which is much better than wasting your action commanding your familiar to attack. Everything else is just kind of gravy on top of that, but some really good stuff too. Without this Eldritch invocation, your familiar is only slightly better than a normal familiar. Although, since this is only an invocation that can be taken by a single subclass of Warlocks, I don't have it at a super high spot, as I kind of valued the non-subclass ones more when making this list. However, Investment of the Chainmaster is so good that it definitely has to make the list nonetheless. Also, pro tip, most of the good familiars you can summon already have a fly speed, so you're better off just giving them the swim speed. That way they have both. And at number 7, we have the Book of Ancient Secrets. This is another invocation which is specific to a subclass, this time the Pact of the Tome Warlocks, which basically gives you 2 free ritual spells. You get to choose any 2 level 1 ritual spells from any class, and you're able to use them from your book as a ritual, which means you don't have to use your spell slots. It also allows you to add a new ritual spell to it if you're able to transcribe them to the book with 2 hours of time and 50 gold for ink. So this invocation is essentially a more versatile ritual caster feat, since it allows you to pick any 2 ritual spells instead of just 2 from one class. And there are a lot of really useful first level ritual spells, like Detect Magic, Find Familiar, Comprehend Languages, Identify, Speak with Animals, and those are just the most useful ones. This is an incredibly useful invocation to pick up on your Pact of the Tome Warlock, for just the pure versatility it allows you to have, and at the very least, allows you to have a familiar as well. And at number 6, we have Shroud of Shadows. This invocation can only be taken if you have at least 15 levels in Warlock, and what it does is allow you to cast the invisibility spell at will without expending any spell slots. Now, being able to use leveled spells infinitely is always pretty good, but invisibility is also an incredibly useful 2nd level spell that grants so many benefits that there's really no reason to never not be invisible if you have this invocation. With this, you're basically permanently invisible until you break it during combat, of course. Even then, during your first round of combat, when you cast a spell or attack which would break the invisibility, you'll have advantage on the first attack, and all attacks against you will have disadvantage before you break it. And of course, there's all kinds of out-of-combat benefits of invisibility, like sneaking past anything, running away, especially running away. Invisibility is really good for that. Although once you're at level 15, invisibility is not as good as it is in earlier levels, especially since it breaks as soon as you cast a spell or attack. However, an infinite amount of invisibilities out of combat, and an invisibility that can't be countered spell since it's at will, is still really good. And at number 5, we have Sculptor of Flesh. This is an invocation that can only be picked up once you have 7 levels in Warlock, and basically allows you to cast the polymorph spell once using one of your spell slots. So it's not like the Shroud of Shadows or Mask of Many Faces, which allows you to cast the spell that grants you an unlimited amount of times, and it even requires your spell slot to use. However, being able to cast polymorph is just really good anyway. Polymorph is a 4th level spell which allows you to transform a creature into a beast that has a challenge rating less than its level, or the creature's challenge rating. So, you can use it on a friendly target or an enemy target if they fail a wisdom saving throw. So you can use it on an enemy target in order to turn them into a mouse or something, as the polymorph also changes the mental statistics of the creature, so if you turn them into a dumb animal, then they have the mental capacity of that animal, and you can just kind of leave them alone or capture them more easily. If you use it on a friendly target, since you have to be level 7 in order to even take this feature, chances are yourself and your friendly targets are going to be at least level 7 as well, which means you can turn them into a giant ape to give them 150 extra health. The giant ape is one of the few beasts that has a ranged attack, hits decently hard, and more importantly, has an intelligence of 7, so you'll have the mental capacity to actually know what you're doing. If you're at least level 8, then you can instead turn into the Tyrannosaurus Rex, who is much dumber but does a lot of damage and can run really fast. Although the giant ape might be a better option anyway because of the intelligence, a higher health, range attack option, and doing about the same amount of damage as a Rex anyway. Although a giant T-Rex is definitely a more cool thing to turn into than a giant ape. Or you can just turn into a lower level beast if you need the utility they might provide, like being able to scout or fly. So really, the reason Sculptor of Flesh is good is because being able to cast Polymorph is good, even if you're only able to use it once per day with this invocation, and even if it takes up one of your spell slots. And at number 4, we have Misty Visions. This invocation allows you to cast the Silent Image spell at will without using any of your spell slots or material components. So another one of the invocations that allows you to cast a spell an infinite amount of times. And what Silent Image does is basically create whatever illusion you want that can fit into a 15-foot cube. Now, how useful a big illusion is really as useful as you are creative and your DM allows you to be. Illusions are pretty tricky and entirely dependent on your campaign and a creative DM. You could use it to create walls, make a distraction, create a big animal to try to scare people, as long as you have some way to mimic the sounds and smell it might provide, since it only creates a visual representation and nothing else. But you can still make walls which can provide cover, can completely hide your characters if you just simply hide inside of the illusion, or can be used to keep up a barrier while your party attempts a short rest to basically save you from wandering creatures. When it comes to first level spells you can cast an unlimited amount of times, Silent Image might be a little bit too strong, or completely useless, as most illusion spells are. And at number 3, we have Devil's Sight. With this invocation, you gain the ability to see in both magical and non-magical darkness out to a distance of 120 feet. Now, this is just straight up a better dark vision, as it gives you full vision in complete darkness, and combos incredibly well if you really like to use the darkness spell to block vision. In fact, you can combine Devil's Sight with darkness in order to throw it on top of an enemy target, go inside the darkness yourself, and have pretty much all attacks done to you at disadvantage, while all of your attacks inside the darkness will be at an advantage since the targets can't see you, giving you a pseudo Foresight 9th level spell at level 2. Assuming you have some way to cast darkness at that level anyway. However, darkness is an incredibly selfish spell, because no one else can see through it unless they also have Devil's Sight. So if you're in a group situation and you're throwing darkness on top of things, the person with Devil's Sight is the only person who's going to be able to actually see them, or plan their attacks with advantage. And also, Devil's Sight does not completely replace dark vision, because there's some technicalities with how Devil's Sight works, where dim light actually still affects you. So if anyone has a torch, that could mess up your Devil's Sight, or even a small candle. Of course, a torch or candle won't work inside a darkness spell, which is the main use of this, so it's not really that big of a deal. Devil's Sight is also available with the Eldritch Adept feat, since it does not have a prerequisite, which actually makes this one of the best options to pick if you actually pick up that feat, since Devil's Sight is competitive with some of the other broken feats, assuming you have liberal access to the darkness spell, of course. And at number 2, we have Ghostly Gaze. This is an invocation from Xander's Guide to Everything, and requires you to be at least level 7 in Warlock in order to pick it up. And what it does is once per day, you're able to see through walls for 1 minute, as you're able to look through solid objects up to a range of 30 feet, which allows you to see everything as ghostly objects and transparent images, and even gives you dark vision during this duration, so you don't have to worry about not being able to see into a dark room that's not lit. So having access to a once per day X-ray vision is incredibly useful. If you're able to use this next to a room of a dungeon, this might allow you to completely circumvent a problematic fight, or turn something that should have been a difficult encounter into a complete cakewalk. Being able to just look through walls for a minute once a day just has all kinds of really good benefits, that it might break a lot of things that DMs have planned. Now, technically, Devil's Sight is always active, but the best use of that is if you also combine it with another spell. Ghostly Gaze is just incredibly useful out of the gate, and has the potential to just completely break encounters, which is why I have it slightly higher, even though Devil's Sight is just so good on its own too. And at number 1, we have Agonizing Blast. This is an invocation which allows you to add your Charisma modifier to each of your Eldritch Blast hits. Eldritch Blast is a cantrip which deals 1d10 force damage, and each time the cantrip dice goes up, instead of just dealing extra damage, it shoots an additional bolt, which can be targeted at something else. And this is easily the best invocation you can take. Most people will take 2 levels of Warlock just to get this invocation, because it turns Eldritch Blast into one of the best damaging cantrips in the game. However, Agonizing Blast has a prerequisite, which basically requires you to know the Eldritch Blast cantrip. But because it technically has a prerequisite, you can't pick it up with the Eldritch Adept feat unless you're a Warlock. Otherwise, it would be one of the best invocations to pick up with that feat if it was available. So if you have a Charisma score maxed out at 20, this adds an extra 5 damage to each Eldritch Blast bolt, which at level 17 when it hits 4 times basically adds an extra 20 damage to each Eldritch Blast. The amount of damage added with this one invocation is just so good that it's just a no-brainer pick, if you're playing a Warlock that uses Eldritch Blast at all, which most of them do. The only other invocations that increase your damage are restricted to certain subclasses or other niche things. This is probably the easiest way to increase your damage at Warlock levels in a free invocation, and by a pretty significant amount too. Alright, and that's the list. There are actually a ton of invocations. If you think I've missed one of the other much better ones that should have been in this video, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And also remember to don't subscribe.